Liz. Hey, Tia. Hey, Amar. Welcome. Hey, Jing Jing. Hey, Danielle. Hey, Felipe. Julia. Awesome. We got more folks coming in. Yay. So Amar found the chat. I'm going to say hi in the chat as well. Yeah, that's how we're going to primarily communicate in tonight's session. I can't hear you. So in this format, we're going to communicate in the chat. You guys can hopefully hear and see me, but I cannot hear or see you. You can and still should participate as much as you would like. You should ask questions. Chat is a great place to ask questions. And there is also a Q&A function that you can use. Chat's fine too. Yeah, so you don't have to worry that everyone can see or hear you. And this session is going to be recorded and eventually go on YouTube. So that's one of the reasons we don't make participants visible or audible, because it's going to be on YouTube. So what I would love you to do, actually, if you could change the to field in your chat to all panelists and attendees, so you're chatting to everybody, not just to me, and say hi, and maybe tell us, where are you signing in from tonight, and where are you at in your GRE process? Are you near the end, near the beginning, somewhere in between? Today, we'll do some combination of chatting together as a group publicly, all panelists and attendees, and chatting just to me. So if you change it to just all panelists, I'm the only person who will see your chat. So if you want to ask something, but you don't want to do it publicly, that's a great way to do it. So say hi in the chat, tell us where are you coming from, and where are you at in the GRE? Oh, that's exciting, in a few days. Yay. I hope that you are then very close to the end of your GRE process and can put it behind you. I think tonight's session will have some tips that will be useful. We're going to look at the logic questions in verbal. Cool. Yay, lots of folks kind of toward the end. All right, so I'm really glad I chose this topic, because I think this will be a place where we can get maybe just like a couple quick tips that might help you get one or two more right in your official test if you are near the end. And if you're more near the beginning, this is also going to be a good introduction to this question type. So hooray. Yay, I'm in NYC too. Lots of New York folks, but folks spread out all over the country and the world. Just one of the beautiful things about being online. If you've never been to a free prep hour before, the way they work is each instructor picks a topic. Tonight's topic is going to be logic-based reading, which was a student request and is a popular topic. We're going to spend an hour on that. I'm going to tell you some stuff, but hopefully we're going to spend most of the time doing some problems together and discussing them. So should be me talking, but hopefully not too much of me talking and you not getting to do any of the fun. They are kind of fun, I think, when you get to a good place with them, these logic questions. The problems that we do tonight are going to be drawn from this book, which if you're more toward the start of your studies, this is a great resource. It is at least 5 pounds. I think it's maybe more now. And it has all different types of verbal and quant questions on all the different topics. So it's a huge resource for just tons of practice problems. And the problems we see tonight are going to be from this. So if you've been working a lot from the 5 pound book, maybe you might recognize 1 or 2 of them, but there's a lot in there, so hopefully not. We're going to start. I just want to kind of introduce what is logic-based reading. Sorry, like what are these questions about? Where do we get them? A couple of fundamental facts. I want to look at a process for how we deal with these little types of reading passages. And then there are a lot of different subtypes of logic-based reading questions. So I want to try to look at least one example of each of the different types tonight, which is maybe an ambitious goal, but I believe in us and doing all of this tonight. I think it's going to be good. So let's talk about what is logic-based reading. So just for folks who are maybe a bit newer to the GRE, you have 2 verbal sections with 20 problems each in them. And these 20 questions are divided into kind of 2 big categories. We have text completion and text completion and sentence equivalents. Those are the fill in the blank vocabulary questions. And then the other half is reading comp. I got a great question. When will this be on YouTube? I think hopefully soon-ish, in the next few weeks, but I do not actually know how quickly that team will get it posted, but I think we're posting them fairly quick these days. Tonight, we're going to focus on one of the specific types of reading comp. So within each verbal section, you are going to get 10 reading comp questions. Your section, that could be slightly bigger. Of those questions, 1 to 3 will be logic-based reading. The other types of reading questions, I think I actually have covered in another recent free prep hour you can probably find on the YouTube channel. So logic-based reading, it's a smaller component of the GRE than the other types of reading, but can still be relatively significant. So worth spending some time with. If you've maybe studied for GMAT, these are very similar to critical reasoning, or if you've done some LSAT, they're very similar to LSAT logical reasoning. So if you end up not liking these, the good news is this is the test, the graduate test, that has the least amount of this logic on it. So if you don't like these, you've made a good choice and come into the GRE. So just a few things to know when we talk about logic-based reading. These are going to be very short passages. We'll see tonight some of these passages are just 2 or 3 or maybe 4 sentences long. So very short, and we just have one question. So if you're going through a section and you're thinking, how do I know that something is a logic question and not a different type of reading question? This is the easiest way to spot them. It will say something like, question 9 is based on the following passage. And that, as soon as you see that one question, cool, it's logic. You're going to switch into logic-based reading mode. The probably most important thing to know about these is, ooh, I hit a little typo. Oops. Let's pretend we never saw that. The most important thing about these is, unlike the rest of reading, they aren't going to ask us so much about the content of the passage, like what is that detail, what is that fact. They're going to ask us about the author's thought process. So how this author is connecting the dots between the different statements that they're making. And I think a lot of what we talk about tonight is going to be around kind of dissecting these passages and imagining what that author's thought process might be. So we're dealing a lot more with the how and the connections, and not as much with just what are the facts, which is more true elsewhere in reading. We are also going to see a lot of different types of questions. So I want to tell you a little bit about the different types of questions in a moment. Before we get at some types of questions, though, I just want to start with some kind of very simple, silly examples of what we might see in a logic question. So we're going to start with some very simple mini arguments. And what I want to illustrate here is, when we get a logic passage on the GRE, we are never going to get a good argument. We're never going to get an argument that we read and think, wow, I am 100% convinced this person has thought of everything. They're always going to have flaws and missing pieces in them. And that's a big concern of ours. What are those flaws? What are those missing pieces? So let's start by looking at some kind of simple examples of logical flaws. My dog ate cheese. My dog barked. Therefore, cheese makes my dog bark. What's wrong with my reasoning here? Like, what's wrong with how I'm thinking? If you have an idea, share it in the chat. Maybe to all panelists and attendees, so your fellow classmates get to see your good ideas too. Yeah, yep, nice, Amar. This is a very classic type of cause and effect argument. It has a very fancy name. Does anyone know the kind of fancy name for this? Or Amar, or anyone else, can you describe in more detail what's wrong with the cause and effect? Yeah, yep, that's causation does not equal, or sorry, I did it backwards. too many C words. Correlation does not equal causation. So here I give you two facts. They're both happening. Eating cheese, barking. The logical flaw is it's not necessarily true that one has to cause the other. I am assuming something. I'm making a leap in reasoning. So here I am assuming causation without proof. Another way to think about this isn't the only explanation, right? Like my dog ate cheese, my dog barked, then maybe a squirrel ran outside and that's what made my dog bark. There could be other causes of this. So this is a simple kind of silly example, but you're gonna see this error come up a lot on the GRE. These little mini errors we're gonna look at now, these are gonna come up in passages. So when I'm going into a logic passage, I'm thinking about it often in this way, like what's wrong with this? What mistake or omission is this person making in how they're thinking? Let's look at another one. My dog is older than the other dogs in the park. Therefore, my dog is old. What's wrong with my thinking in this example? Yeah, we don't know if the other dogs are young or not. Like we don't know what the age of the other dog. So yeah, we're making some assumptions here. And specifically, often when I'm thinking about what's wrong with an argument, I really focus on the conclusion that's being drawn. So what's wrong with this conclusion? To say like, fact, my dog is older than the other dogs, therefore my dog is old. Yeah, Shandy. Oh, sorry, Shandley. I missed the L in your name. Sorry about that. Shandley. Totally nicely put. Just because my dog is older, that doesn't mean my dog is old. The other dogs, yeah, like Amar said, the other dogs could all be really young. And then maybe my dog is only a year old, but she's still older than the other dogs. This is actually often true these days because everyone got puppies during the pandemic. So now my dog is not old, but she is often the old dog in the park. So this is another common error. Like a relative amount is not the same as an absolute amount. So saying that one thing is bigger or smaller doesn't mean that it is big or small. If you see comparisons in a passage, sometimes if you see things like ratios or percents, this is a good error to be alert for. Alert to. All right, one more. My dog is afraid of cats. Recently, we moved to a neighborhood with very few cats. Therefore, my dog will no longer be scared on her walks. What's wrong with the conclusion I'm reaching here? What mistake am I making? Yeah, like fewer cats or few cats doesn't mean there are no cats. That's definitely one of the problems here. GRE arguments often have more than one problem, like this one. What else? What else am I maybe not thinking of or leaving out or not dealing with? Yeah. Yep. That's a big one too. So I'm eliminating one problem. So kind of like eliminate one problem, but still lots of others. And my dog is in fact also scared of trucks and buses and cardboard boxes, plastic bags. She has lots of fears. So cats are not our only problem. One thing I just want to point out, because it's come up, Taylor said something really astute and useful. I'm assuming the dog won't be afraid of something. And that language, assuming and assumption, is going to come up a lot when we deal with logic passages. I want to say something about it. I'm going to circle back to this in a moment again to reinforce. But when we talk about assumption, we're talking about something that is not said, but has to be true for the conclusion to be valid. So here, to reach my conclusion, I'm assuming that a small number of cats is not scary. I don't say it, but if I knew that a small number of cats was scary, then my whole conclusion wouldn't make sense. So that's something we're going to be looking at a lot. What are those things that are not said, but are actually really important for me to feel convinced of my conclusion? And we're going to see some question types that actually just ask us specifically to identify assumptions. So we're going to do some practice with that tonight. Also, just want to remind you guys, if you have questions as we go along, like throw them in the chat. Let me know if anything doesn't feel clear or anything is confusing. I want to make sure I answer all your questions. So let's now turn our attention just to what are the types of questions that we're going to be asked. What are we going to be asked to do when we get one of these logic passages? One thing we're going to be asked to do is identify an assumption. We just talked a little bit about that. I'll say more about that in a moment. What's a piece of this argument that's missing? We might also be asked to strengthen or weaken. And the super important thing in here is when I strengthen or weaken an argument, I'm focused on the conclusion. I want to make that conclusion more or less likely. We could be asked to evaluate an argument, in which case we're going to ask a question. If the answer to that question is yes, the argument gets better. If it's no, the argument gets worse. We might be asked to draw an inference. These are going to be slightly different, and we'll get to look at one and see how they're different. But here we're given a set of facts, and then we're going to look for another fact that we can prove. We might be asked to resolve a paradox. I promised you there were lots of types of questions. Here we're given something that's surprising, something like, two things that don't seem to go together. And then we're asked to add in a fact that would explain why these two surprising things are happening together. And then finally, we're going to be asked about structure, where they'll highlight two parts of the argument, and we will be asked to say what roles those highlighted parts play. This is the only type we're not going to take a look at tonight, structure, because I taught a free prep hour specifically just on these structure questions over the summer, and I think that's now on YouTube. So if you particularly find you want to go like deep into structure questions, go check on YouTube. There's a whole hour on those. But these first 5 tapes, we're going to look at least one example of each of these. Before we get into our first question, though, and I promise it's coming soon, there's just a couple pieces of terminology that are going to be really helpful as we start unpacking and discussing these logic passages. First one is premises. These are the facts, or maybe sometimes claims, things that are not sort of set in stone, but any of the smaller statements that build up to our conclusion. So my dog ate cheese, my dog barked. Those are my premises. A really important thing when you're dealing with logic-based reading, always accept the premises as true. Don't argue with them. So in real life, if we want to argue with someone, we might say your facts are wrong. GRE's facts and premises are never wrong. So we always accept that these are true, even if we don't like them. The other really important component, obviously, the conclusion. What is that big claim that we are building up to, that statement the author is trying to convince us of? It usually comes at the end. Sometimes it comes at the beginning. It's always the biggest and usually most uncertain claim that's presented in the argument. Sometimes we get nice signal words like thus or therefore. Therefore, cheese causes my dog to bark. That would be your conclusion. And the final piece, mentioned it before, I want to say this several times because it's one of the things that I think I see a lot of students forgetting when they work with logic questions, but that's super important and helpful. Definition of assumptions. These are those pieces that are not stated, but have to be true for the conclusion to be valid. So in this example, the big assumption would be nothing else caused my dog to bark. If I want to conclude that the cheese caused the dog to bark, I need to assume that there was nothing else that could have caused the barking. Then my conclusion makes sense. Notice though, if not true, if I say, for example, a squirrel ran by the window and my dog likes to bark at squirrels. If I told you that an assumption is not true, now my conclusion falls apart because I've given us an alternate explanation. So if an assumption is not true, conclusion fails. And that can often be a really good way if you're doing an assumption question and you're like, oh, I'm stuck between two and I don't know. Ask yourself, what happens if these aren't true? And that can give you a lot of light into what a true assumption is. And we'll do an assumption question. We'll get to kind of see that in action in a moment. All right. Anything I can clarify so far? Questions, concerns? Awesome. So we're going to start our first question. And this one, I'm going to kind of walk us through, and I'm going to kind of show you how I approach a question like this. Once we've done this one, the next one, I'm going to have you try out your own approach on it. But for this one, I want to model what for me is a really helpful process when I see a logic question. So the first thing that I do when I see a logic question is actually look at the question, because I just have one. And as we just saw, there's lots of different types. So I want to know before I read the passage, what's going to be my task or my goal. And this just asks me to identify an assumption. So on my paper, I'm going to write this to indicate it's an assumption question. I might put an S for strengthen, W for weaken, just to keep myself focused on my task. And then I always write down an all of verbal A, B, C, D, E, so that I can eliminate letters as I go. And that really helps me to stay organized, to stay calm, to keep my mind clear, because these can be quite dense. Next thing I do, I go back and I read the passage, and I read these logic passages very closely. So with the other types of reading, you may have gotten advice to skim or not process all the details or be a little bit lighter. With logic, I'm very attentive. And I'm going to read each sentence and kind of give myself a moment to process it and then take a note. I take a lot of notes in logic. As I'm taking those notes, I'm starting to think about what's a premise, what's a conclusion, how are these pieces fitting together? Like I'm really trying to connect the dots. So let's do it. Inorganic pesticides remain active on the surfaces of fruits and vegetables for several days after spraying. All right, so I actually am going to pause there because this is a long sentence. So I have inorganic and they stay on surface. Cool. While organic pesticides dissipate within a few hours of application, leaving the surface of the sprayed product free of pesticide residue. So organic, gone from surface after, 3+ hours, something like that. I use a lot of symbols. I use a lot of shorthand because I'm trying to go fast. These are my premises. I got a fact about inorganic. I got a fact about organic. All right. Therefore, okay, so when I see that, I'm starting to think about a conclusion. Therefore, when purchasing from a farm that uses inorganic pesticides, one must be careful to wash the produce thoroughly before eating it to prevent ingestion of toxins. That makes sense, right? Because the inorganic stays on the surface. So cool. I have my conclusion, wash, inorganic. It seems like good advice. But one need not worry about ingesting pesticides when purchasing from farms that use only organic. So no worries, organic. So this is going to be my little chart. Now, before I start jumping into those answer choices, I want to think a moment. I'm going to be asked about assumptions. So I want to think for a moment, what's missing here? Like, what has this author not considered? What might an assumption or a gap or a problem in this argument be? So I'm going to ask you guys to do that in the chat. Anything that stands out here, a missing piece, something the author left out. Ooh, yeah. I like that. I got a chat that said, you know, did the producer wash these before selling, you know? That makes a lot of sense, right? It feels like it's assuming that things aren't washed by the sellers. I'm gonna. What else? Ooh, yeah. No, I like that. There's no other sources of toxins. Only pesticides. Yeah. That's often a good kind of category of thing, right? Like, what else could go wrong? So that might be one way to think about finding an assumption here. What else could go wrong in washing? Yeah, I gotta check. Do I need to assume all farmers use pesticides? It doesn't really matter. And this is actually a really interesting and useful point. It says when purchasing from a farm that uses inorganic or use only organic. So the conclusion is actually just kind of defining itself as farms that use inorganic or organic pesticides. So there could be farms that don't use any pesticides, but they're not really being dealt with. Cool. I want to point out one other thing. One thing that I kind of noticed about our facts as I was reading this is it tells us a lot about the surfaces. But then we're going to be eating and ingesting. What's maybe an assumption that's happening there? If we're given a lot of facts about surfaces, but then we're eating these whole fruits and vegetables. Yeah, that's another assumption. Because if pesticides get inside, then we have a whole other problem. Like washing the surface or not washing the surface is not going to help us out. So, like I said, these are not strong arguments. There's often going to be lots of possible assumptions. So as you're doing this, it's worth, predict one or two assumptions or flaws. You may then find that your prediction isn't in the answers, but that active predicting is still going to help you a lot, give you a good framework for evaluating the answers given. So let's go ahead and take a look at the answers. When you have one you like, send a private chat. So chat just to all panelists. Which letter would you pick? All right. If you haven't yet chatted, take a moment, make up your mind, chat me what you got. Cool. So we're a little split between two answers. That's true. I can do a poll. I don't like the poll function though. Kind of bugs me. I know it's really silly, but I, for some reason, always prefer chat. That's my own weird quirk. We're kind of split between two, A and D. And that's kind of often going to happen in reading. You know, I think there's a lot of questions I do where I feel like there's 3 quick eliminations, and then maybe I have to think a little more closely about 2 of them. So this is where we could bring in an idea that I mentioned earlier, where if I negate an assumption, and if an assumption is not true, then my conclusion should fall apart. So let's try that with A. What if I told you, okay, not all produce that has been treated with inorganic pesticides will be labeled. So, you know, inorganic pesticides, not 100% compliance with labeling at point of sale. How does that impact our conclusion? I take the opposite of A. Say, all right, the labeling's maybe not always going to be there. Yeah, we wouldn't know that it needs to be washed if it weren't labeled. Totally true. Would the author's point still stand though? Like, I think that's what you want to ask. Like, would it still be a good idea to wash the inorganic pesticide produce, even if I weren't sure if it was inorganic or not? It's still a good idea. I should still wash it. So A is maybe saying it could be hard to follow this advice, but it's not saying this advice is not going to help you. You still are going to want to be washing that stuff, even if it's hard for you to identify what it is. So this is one that, you know, maybe impacts how feasible, but doesn't really mean it's a bad conclusion. And that's what I'm really looking for. The conclusion just doesn't make sense at all. So we can get rid of A. And just to kind of illustrate what happens, if I negate D, organic pesticides are capable of penetrating the skin of a fruit or vegetable, well, then I'm in a lot of trouble, because this argument's telling me that they're going to leave the surface, so I don't have to worry about them on the surface. But if they go inside that fruit or vegetable, then maybe they're still there when I eat them. So D, when I negate it, makes this seem like pretty bad advice, because I no longer can trust that the insides of these things are safe to eat. So that's what I'm looking for in assumption. It's a very high bar. Is this really necessary for me to believe my conclusion? Or is this kind of nice to have, which is a little bit weaker, and that doesn't make something a true assumption? And D is our correct answer. All right. I'm now going to turn you guys over to try a different one, and we're going to look at a different type of question. As I said, I wanted to try to show you all the types of questions tonight. Before we do, anyone got questions on this one? Anything I can clarify? Cool. So I'm just going to say one thing about this. This is going to be a most strongly supports. So when you see support or weaken, you're looking for make the conclusion more. Ooh, I did get some questions. I moved on too soon. Sorry. We're gonna step back to our previous slide for a moment. B is a little bit ambiguous. I got a question. Why is B not correct? Within hours, a few hours, it's it's close enough. You know, if this said like it dissipates 4 hours after application and people get it 1 hour after, like if it were really precise, I think it would be closer to being oh, I'm sorry, I got this backwards. Ignore what I just said. If this is true, it weakens the argument, right? Because we have a few hours, and if it's within hours, it's saying like, okay, you know, the produce is getting there too quickly. So this weakens, but that's not the same as an assumption. An assumption is like, okay, this has to be true for this argument to work. And B is something that's saying actually undermining the argument. I started talking about that too soon before I had fully thought it through. So B is kind of a good answer for a different question, which would be weaken the conclusion. I don't think I can go that far back to pull up the passage with the notes, unfortunately. I can only kind of backtrack so far into. All right, really good question about B. I'm glad that came up because it's often a common trap in these. You know, if I get a strengthen, there'll be a weaken answer. If I get an assumption, there'll be a strengthen or weaken answer. That's why I always start with identifying the question stem itself. So now let's look at most strongly supports. And just to emphasize, because being clear on your task is crucial in argument questions, make the conclusion more likely to be true. So I'm going to give all of you a minute-ish, maybe a minute and a half, to read through this argument and kind of map it out. What are the premises? What are the conclusions? What is the conclusion? Sorry, there's just one. While you're doing that, I'll make a map and then I'll show you what I would do and kind of compare. So take a moment, work through it. All right, let's pause there. Can folks still, I got a chat that maybe you can't see the passage. Can folks still see the passage on the screen? Cool. If you're having trouble seeing it, maybe you accidentally minimize the Zoom window, or maybe you could just minimize it and pull it up again. Maybe it's just like a little glitch. Hoping that's it. All right, so I'll show you my very not pretty notes, but this is the kind of notes I would take on this. I'd really break it down. Like, used to not be nice to live on the water in cities, so a lot of the waterfront was for commercial buildings, not very pretty. Now, however, people really think it's nice to live on the water, so they pay a lot of money for beach homes. As a conclusion, if you wanted to make a big profit, you should buy up some urban waterfront lots and put some nice residential buildings on them. And if you live in New York or probably other coastal cities, you might feel the relevance of this to the way the city has developed. What if anything stands out as being an assumption or something that's flawed about this person's reasoning? Like if this was your friend who's like, I'm going to buy a lot of urban waterfront lots and put residential buildings on them and that will make me rich. What might you caution them with? Like, ooh, but have you thought about what? Ooh, yeah. I got a couple nice things in the chat. Are the lots still affordable? Is there still demand for these? Will there still be demand for residential buildings? Will people actually pay a lot of money for these? You know, like we know people pay a lot of money for vacation beach homes, but does that mean they'll pay a lot in the city? Are the lots still available? So when we're looking at assumption, this person is assuming that you can profit off this. They're assuming there's demand for these buildings. People are going to pay a lot of money for these houses. You can still get these lots at a low enough price that you could profit off them. Cool. So now we thought about some of the flaws, but remember now our task is going to be to support this conclusion. So we're looking for something that fills in one of these holes, that tells us there's demand, people want to pay a lot, you can get these at a reasonable price, something like that, that's reinforcing this idea that this is a good plan, that we're going to make a profit from this. So let's go ahead and take a look at our answers. Yeah, when you like, send the chat just to me. All right, go ahead and pick your answer. Chat me what it is. So one thing that I think is important to note about the way an argument or logic-based reading question is worded is most strongly supports. So we may in fact find that there's a couple that seem to support, and we always want to think about which of them gives the best, strongest support. And we also want to make sure we stay very closely focused on our conclusion that we can turn a profit by buying these lots and putting residential buildings on them. So we have to be able to buy low and sell high. Those are the two components of our turning a profit. So let's go through and look at our answers here. A, people have more money to spend on real estate. I don't think anyone liked A here. Good to rule it out. Just because people have more money doesn't mean that they will. Like can is not the same as will. So this is making a weak case. B, homeowners will be willing to spend large sums on residential properties in traditionally industrial or commercial districts. So people are willing to spend a lot of money for a house that's in a place similar to these waterfront properties, because they tell us that these waterfront properties were mostly industrial and commercial. So B is reinforcing an important part of our profit equation, that we can sell high. So I like B. I'm going to leave it in. C, many urban waterfront lots are available for purchase. This is nice, right? It's telling me that I can buy. So that's good. That does help. But I need to know that I can buy affordably, that I can buy cheaply. That's the important part for turning a profit. So while C is telling me, yeah, you will be able to do this, it's not reinforcing the profit idea as strongly as B. So this is where the most strongly supports is really important. B supports a little bit. This plan is actionable, but it doesn't hit as strongly on this idea of profit as C. So I'm going to, sorry, B hits more strongly on the idea of profit than C does. So I'm going to get rid of C. D, coastal cities are encouraging developers to rehabilitate the waterfront through tax incentives. So that again is also suggesting maybe we can sort of buy lower. But we don't know too much about this tax incentive. So we're like, maybe we get a little financial break, but here we know we're going to get a big lot of money, large sums from the buyer. So here again, D is like a little bit strengthening, but not as compellingly as B is. So I'm going to get rid of that. And then for E, properties in interior residential districts are significantly more expensive than those along the waterfront. This is like an arrow we saw earlier. Just because one is more expensive than the other doesn't mean the other one is cheap. So E might try to trick us into thinking, oh, these are going to be cheap to buy, but we don't know that for sure. We just know the relative amount. So we can get rid of E, and B is our right answer. What is a lesson to learn from this? What's a takeaway? Yeah, these questions are hard. That's why I'm doing them, because I get asked about them a lot, and I get asked about them a lot because they are hard. However, I think there's a lot of recurring patterns in these. So if you practice more with them, and you also take the time to do what we just did here, to kind of analyze each of the answers, you'll find that they get better over time, because you understand the sort of patterns of GRE thought more. Always, you know, there may be more than one that supports, but always one that most supports. So B is telling me I can sell these buildings. I can sell these buildings for a lot of money. C is telling me I can buy them, but just because I can buy them, there's nothing to suggest that there's going to be profit here. D is telling me I can buy them maybe with a little bit of a tax break, but again, it's not telling me that I'm going to be able to turn a profit on them. Whereas B is the one that most directly gives us information that suggests there is in fact a profit to be made. It's that profit idea that's the most important thing to reinforce. All right, I think we have time to look at least one more. So let's look at a new type. It's going to be a little similar to assumption, strength, and weaken, but it's going to take a slightly different direction, which is evaluate. Which of the following would be most relevant to evaluating? So here my job is to ask a question. Ask a question. And often, you know, if the answer is yes, it strengthens. If no, it weakens. So here, I'm still going to be thinking about what are the flaws, what are the assumptions, but instead of saying this is an assumption or in trying to make the conclusion better, I'm just going to ask a question. What's happening with that thing the author's not dealing with here? So I'm going to give you guys a little bit more open-ended free rein with this one, as we've done a little more practice. So I'm going to give you a minute or so just to start by processing this passage. And then after a minute, I'll put up the answer choices. All right, when you're ready, go ahead, chat me your answer. Cool. I want to actually, we're going to come back to these questions in a moment, but I'm going to, the answer choice in a moment, I'm going to cover them up because I just want to spend a second on the passage. What is the conclusion of this passage? Yeah, yep. Increase retail chocolate. And our premises, our facts leading up to this are not much from the cacao harvest and increase of the price for cocoa solids and butter. Now, a really important thing to remember when we are dealing with these questions is that we never argue with the facts. So if they tell us there was a bad harvest and the fungus killed a lot of trees, if they tell us that the price of these two ingredients has increased significantly and is unlikely to fall. I accept that that's true. So when I'm evaluating this argument, I'm not going to ask any questions around evaluating these two facts. Same as with assumptions, same as with strength and weaken. What I am looking to do is to ask questions about what's not being said, so that I can determine if this conclusion is a good conclusion. Will the retail price of chocolate go up? But I take for granted that cocoa solids and cocoa butter prices are going up, that the trees are dying off. So with that in mind, are there any answer choices here that we can eliminate because they are trying to question or argue with the facts given? Any answer choice you're like, yeah, we can get rid of that because that's really just trying to quibble with facts that have already been asserted. Yeah, yep, we can definitely get rid of D. Doesn't matter what percentage of trees were affected because we know that it's a bad harvest. Like, damage is already done. It's a lot of trees. We have a bad harvest. The prices have gone up. It's over. Doesn't matter. Even if the fungus is eliminated within the next 6 months, we still have this problem. We still have had a bad harvest and have limited supply. So maybe, you know, deep in the future, this would fix it. Too far away. And yeah, I agree. I think also A. Doesn't matter what's happened in other periods because they've already told us, okay, these prices have gone up. So even if they haven't in other periods, they have now, and that's what matters. All right, so we're down to B and C. And the question we're trying to answer is, will the retail price of chocolate increase? Which of these questions will help us answer that? B. Does consumers' willingness to spend more determine what the retail price is going to be? I agree with folks who are saying not really. Because if the chocolate is super expensive to make, we're going to have to sell it for more no matter what. You know, we're not going to sell a chocolate that's like 3/4 of the cost because that's what people will pay. It doesn't make any sense to do that. So what people are willing to spend or not, that's not going to be the biggest determiner. The biggest determiner in the price of chocolate is how much it's going to cost us to make it. Now let's look at C. If the other ingredients in chocolate have decreased, if the answer to this is yes, then the retail price doesn't have to go up, right? The price could stay the same because everything else is cheaper. So even though cocoa solids and cocoa butter have gone up, maybe we can keep the cost the same and keep the retail price the same. If the answer to this is no, the other ingredients in chocolate have stayed the same or gone up, then my price is going to have to increase. So I'm asking this question sort of about what's not being said here, right? Like, we get information about cocoa solids and cocoa butter, but those are just two components. And so there's a jump from these two components to the whole finished product's retail price. And that's that gap that C is trying to get into. All right, we are almost at the end of our time. But before we go, I want to just give you a couple quick tips about these. Big thing to keep in mind, if you see a logic question, if you see just one question on a passage, know what your task is. You know, look at the question and remind yourself, all right, if I'm strengthening or weakening, I'm trying to make that conclusion, that specific conclusion, more or less likely. If I'm asked for an assumption, I need to identify something that's not said that's necessary. If I'm evaluating, again, I need to ask a question about that missing piece of the argument. I do not want to argue with the facts. focus on how the author is thinking. If you can spot kind of common flaws or problems, that will help. I find taking notes invaluable in these logic questions. I don't take a ton of notes when I read, but I take a ton of notes in logic, especially when I'm tired, because as we're seeing, they're dense, they're hard, the answer choices are weird. So the more you can really get solid on what the argument is, the happier you'll be. And always take a moment to have some prediction or focus before you go to the answers. It'll often help you make faster, more decisive choices about those answers. All right, I know we did not get to inference and to resolve a paradox tonight. Maybe a later free prep hour in the winter, I'll try to do one that focuses on those two question types. They're a little bit rarer, and I think in some ways not as hard as the types we covered tonight. So I'm glad we did the 4 types, or yeah, strength and weaken kind of opposite. So I'm glad we did those tonight. All right, thank you so much for being here. For the bunch of folks who are taking the test in the next few days, the next week, good luck. I hope it goes super well and you can be done with this. And for folks who are more at the start, happy studying, and definitely check out these free prep hours. Are all posted on YouTube. There's a ton of stuff on there, lots of resources. You can also always come to the first session of one of our full courses for free, and that'll be a 3-hour class that's like full intro to kind of basic GRE facts and strategies. So if you're newer and starting out, that might be a good next step. I think our YouTube channel is just Manhattan Prep GRE. You can find us there. We've got some vocab videos as well, some other fun stuff on there. All right, thanks so much, guys. Have a good night.